looking forward to make an interesting discussion about what we learn out of the pandemic with this panel. I think we don't need to present yourself. I think you were all before on the scene. So I think first we'll discuss between us some question, and then I think very welcome if there are further questions from the room. With a very strong light, it's very difficult to see if someone wants to raise a question, so perhaps just speak if there is an important question. At least from my place, it's very difficult to look at the room. So I think one of the important topics is about learning from this pandemic, and there is still a lot of work to be done in the NRP 80, where you are also going to find some important points. But I think we could do a small roundtable with the experts, what we have already learned from this crisis, mainly in the perspective of the future. You know, is there a possibility to manage better? This is perhaps the easiest question first, how to manage better future pandemic, and then we can perhaps go to the more complex question, could we prevent or react better to avoid a worldwide pandemic, but perhaps about the management, how to deal with the pandemic. Perhaps we can begin by the international expert first, or if someone wants to take the first question. You know, about management, what did we learn?
Are you thinking from the Swiss perspective, or are you thinking sort of in general for scientific perspective for any country?
I think also with you coming from Denmark and US, perhaps an international perspective.
Yeah, right.
And perhaps Marcel and others could look at the Swiss perspective.
But I think I'll say something about the Swiss, So I've been here now for almost 24 hours, and I think I have learned a lot, and I've been very impressed with the level of presentations and thoughts that are going on here, and the interdisciplinarity that you have eventually come to, and the fact that there has been funding like that. It seems organized, and I mean it's really quite impressive actually. So I would give you that first of all. I mean, all of you, that's nice to see something like that. It's something, the business of interdisciplinarity is something that. For me, I only met it the first time during the Ebola crisis, realizing who stopped that Ebola in West Africa in 2014-15. It was not the vaccines, it was not the medical treatments, it was really the behavioral scientists and the anthropologists finding a way to communicate to people how not to get in contact, how to stay away from danger really. And so that was like, oh my God, we need other people on the team. That was the first time. That's not so long ago for me. Maybe I was just slow. It's possible. And now in this COVID pandemic in my country, it was just totally random. I think that a private sector foundation funded a social science project that ended up being really, really important in securing democracy, I think, in Denmark during the crisis. It's called the Hope Project, and it was, to my mind, it sort of secured a polling and a communication with people throughout the pandemic. So, what do you think of masks? What did you do last week? Did you go to work when you had symptoms? Whatever it was. So there was always this communication back to people what they actually. So I was thinking, that's something I hadn't seen before the pandemic. I hadn't seen it coming. How important it is to secure that kind of level of communication and forth and back as that represented. So that was just my little thought about it. And then the other thing is, when I think about preparedness for the next pandemic, I thought of it very simply, like we cannot come into a future pandemic without a test strategy in place, equipment in place, because we are so blind without that. It's just almost ridiculous. And the other thing, it's only reasonable that we have thought of a way to prepare as security for the first responders. There should always be enough equipment to secure our nurses and doctors and ambulance drivers, so they don't put themselves in harm's way when they don't have to. And that's something that I was shocked at how little prepared we were for that kind of thing. I really hope we get better on that. And all the stuff you talked about was more about how the science can prepare. But that's kind of almost like if this was a food pyramid, I'm at the bottom layer. How should we secure we survive with the simplest things?
Perhaps about the management, we can also go beyond what science did, but also politicians and others, and perhaps the Swiss experts have a bit more critical view about what we learn and what we could do better in the management of the pandemic, another pandemic. Don't know who want to speak about that.
Yeah, I mean, I can take a shot. I think. Well, what we learned scientifically, we will soon be able to read in a beautiful final report of the 78. But of course, many other projects as well. I mean, that's clear, right? I think scientifically we learned a ton, and many surprising things also. I mean, you know, I guess going into the pandemic, I guess a lot of people working in this field would have. Also have said, right, that they have been quite certain about some things, and then they were surprised, right, that it didn't turn out to be like this. And some of the things were fairly fundamental. I mean, you know, this whole airborne business and what we just talked about yesterday, the speed of vaccine production and so on. Then, right, when you ask, okay, what have we learned? I mean, the question to me is always a bit, who is we, right? And watching some of the 10 for 10 recently, I've realized, all right, people have learned very different things from the pandemic, and they are in full conflict with each other. If you take two people and you ask them what have they learned. So, yeah, I think there will be some antibodies in the system, some general do's and don'ts that we will take that will wane over time, that we perhaps need to institutionalize in one way or another. But yeah, otherwise...
Antibodies of ideas?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's certain things, right, where we realize, okay, I mean, nobody had any living memory of how to handle a truly massive pandemic. And so some of the things we relearned, and if we talk to some of you, right, who are historians, or you, right, you tell us, look, actually, right, it was exactly the same, and we have just collectively forgotten. But yeah, I think the future will show what we've learned. I'm not generally super optimistic, I have to say. Maybe it's just this Credit Suisse thing that gives me a bit pause. But I think, right, we shouldn't be cynical. I think that's the most important thing. We should say, look, I mean, as scientists, right, it is our job to just make the science better and to continue to make the science better. And then whatever the social setup will be, whatever the political setup will be, it's not in our control. But what we can control is to say, we will deliver, right? We will deliver the results and hope that there is someone on the receptive side.
Perhaps a more difficult question, if you have to do some recommendation to the Office of Public Health to better manage a future pandemic, what would you make your four recommendation?
Yeah. It's clear, right? It's not per se my job as a scientist to tell the public health what they should do, but as a citizen, right? Let me just preface this as a citizen, I really want a public health office that is much more in touch with the cutting edge science that's going on. That I wish as a citizen, and it's hard to actually give a concrete recommendation, because at the end of the day, the way administration works in Switzerland is very powerful, and by design, right? It's a good thing, because it's not just a random person or politician can come along and somehow mess everything up, right? This is some real stability built into the system. But it also means that, okay, if the people who are there just don't want that at the moment, right? Then there's relatively little you can do, and that's frustrated many. But I hope, right, we go a bit back, and if you look at the Federal Office of Public Health, for example, during the HIV crisis, I mean, I wasn't really around at that level, I was way too young, but it seems from, again, looking at the history, that the science had a bigger role in, and I hope we can get there again and have a much more productive relationship together. That will help.
before going to the social science, I will not forget about the clinical side. Emanuela, would you have some suggestion how we could better react, better treat? What were the errors that were done on the clinical side?
First, I think we all intensivists, we learned a lot, which can be transferred to other patients too. For example, specific aspects of artificial ventilation, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation became to a routine, daily routine in ICUs, which patients are really fitting for an organ transplantation. So from the medical point of view, as intensivists, we had a very rapid learning phase, which can be transferred to other patients. I think this is quite important. The other thing is, I quite frequently thinking back to other long-term consequences of this period. For example, relatives which could not visit anymore their husband, daughter, whatever, just had to be transferred to a hospital as an emergency. Just had a phone call and rapidly deteriorated and died during the night. And as an MD, you had to call up the relative at home. It was catastrophic situation from the emotional aspect. And I think to involve more earlier and more frequently the social sciences in those crises is a very important aspect. Or another consequence are the children at school. Is there a gap of education which will be relevant for the society later? Or actually what I find very impressive is that we have a MD student generation now passing the final examinations who never saw a patient during the studies. What is the impact of that?
Yeah.
So,
can we still fix that?
and there are many side effects from the cultural side too, which were not really realized to be handled during the crisis, I think. So these were my most important impressions.
Mm. Perhaps from the social science, there might be perhaps a more critical view, what could have been done better in Switzerland or worldwide. I think, for example, on the acceptance by the population of the measure, perhaps vaccine uptake in Switzerland was likely not as high as in some other country. Do you have some suggestion you would do to the authority or public health about what to do better in what we could have done better in this pandemic?
Yeah. Well, obviously, many actors in the system realize, okay, it's not sufficient to develop a vaccine. It's important to have people willing to be vaccinated and all the other measures. Really, these are crucial factors that have, also their importance, because otherwise it will not simply not help. I think many actors realize this, and so I'm actually confident that in future crises also these voices will be heard, hopefully. I think Samuel made a strong case that these voices were also heard in this pandemic. So I think we did not too bad, but also see we had to realize the limitations, certainly, of many social science research that we have. From an outside perspective, maybe not like very precise measures, right? So it's perception we measure. We have samples that can be questioned. We have bias in the sample and so forth. So there are some weaknesses, but nevertheless, I think we also had this steep learning curve, as we heard before in medical treatment, so that I think social scientists realize, okay, we have to try to be more precise in a way, but also provide tools that help us monitor things over time. So, for example, the problem that we might have, not a super precise measure in with respect to how many people are already vaccinated, is not as dramatic if we are interested in change over time. So when we have a measurement in place, so that we can see whether certain things has positive or negative effects, that is information enough, right? And so we should have the strengths to stand on this information we have. With respect to the implementation preparedness for the management in a future crisis, I think after being read all these proposals for the NRP 80, I'm very confident that we will deliver good insights on the white spots that are still there and provide really solid evidences for future decision makers. However, I think the challenges are also that we need to keep the attention high on this topic. I mean, we realize for this conference, for example, representatives of the federal administration did cancel at last minute because they have now another crisis to fix, right? And so this attention really is limited, and the resources are limited, and so it will be potentially hard to get all this knowledge we have created and will create in the next years, actually to the stakeholders that would be important to be addressed. And ultimately, it will then be at the end certainly an issue whether all these perspectives and these dimensions that we are in the social science and humanities are interested in, whether there are advocates within the parliamentary system to advocate for the interests of, let's take the children of and the school system, or for elderly people and retirement homes and so forth. So it is ultimately also a question whether there are the advocates that will make use of these evidences to influence the decisions. And this is certainly not our thing to work on primarily. We're scientists, but so we will focus on delivering the evidences, and this is then the basis, hopefully, for a better crisis management.
Yeah, but your idea about advocates in among the politics for pandemic, it's likely a difficult issue, because you have a advocate for chronic problem like insurance, healthcare cost, social, shares, but for a pandemic, it's difficult as a politician to sell it, because it might come in 5 years, in 10 years, and do you think there will be some advocates of preventing a future pandemic among the politics, or?
Unlikely.
Sorry for the tough question. Just before opening the question to the floor, about, as you mentioned in your talk, likely a future pandemic is going to come. We don't know when, maybe in 5 years, 10 years, earlier. What would you recommend to the WHO or to some national authority, what to do to avoid a pandemic? Not sure it is possible, or to detect it early enough that you might perhaps avoid a very global pandemic as we got, if it is possible. Do you have some specific recommendation? I don't know, about testing, about...
That was a lot of questions in one. I mean, when it comes to trying to avoid that the next pandemic will even arise, of course you have to look in the zoonotic interface, and there are ways, and also in laboratory studies, that can be risky in that regard. It's something that we didn't speak much about here, but there's actually research that is called gain-of-function research that we are some people who think can be too risky compared to the gains that you can have scientifically from them. Because potentially you could have a pandemic virus that is just getting out of a laboratory by mistake, even though all of it was for public good, then it ends up being a disaster. That's kind of a way to avoid things in the future. Another thing, of course, is we have for the second time had a pandemic that's linked to wet markets in certain parts of the world. Can't we get better at that? I mean, this is we learned it in SARS in 2003. Now we learned it again in 2019-20. That would be something to look at. How do you have less risky food markets, for example? So there are things you can do to sort of try to not make it come, but otherwise it's really hard because there are like so many threats out there. It's not even funny. There's the flus again. There will be coronavirus again, and then all the viruses we didn't think about, right? So it's a hard one to just go after each one of them or something. You can't do that. I just want to echo before I lose my turn. I want to echo something you said. I think if there's one take-home message that I would to bring to public health officials, it is that it's not alone. It's not enough to create a really effective solution to the problem. The problem is just right after that is how can you make sure that actually people would want to take this vaccine? It's the only thing that stands between you and this virus which will find you. What does it take to actually make that communication clear that it's risk and against the benefits, etc.? That I think is really important. And in Europe, there's a whole new effort to try to make health across the European Union. Maybe it's not so much for you, but that actually tries to. Because if I was to say one other thing to them is we cannot have another pandemic where we close borders and deal with ourselves and we're not able to help each other or to learn together or whatever. So I think that has to be rethought. We have to, as a whole continent, to do a lot better the next time. Work together.
Thank you. Marcel, you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important point. And, we had some results, right, from here to show, right, just how useless this border stuff is. Yeah. But, of course, in terms of making sure that countries actually share the data early, that's been a real disaster. I mean, right? I mean, put yourself in the shoes of South Africa, being a good community member and saying, hey, we have something here that's going to be, and the answer from the international community is, okay, you know what, we're done with you, right? No more business. I mean, that's sending very much the wrong signal, and so that's should be an obvious learning, I think, for public health and the international community to put some regulation in there to the extent that that's legally possible, that countries can feel safe that if they play their part and they're the unlucky ones, or in fact the scientifically good ones, right, to detect this early on, that they're not going to get punished. That's one of the learnings, certainly.
That's a good one.
Do you want to add something on this topic of future pandemic?
Yeah, I would add on this that obviously also communication is going across borders, right? So, I mean, all the reporting about regulations, other countries, they raise questions then in your own country, whether they are harsher or less harsh. So, certainly also this has to be taken into account. And people are smart enough to compare information and see what other countries are doing. So certainly this is a challenging task. While at the same time you would not limit your autonomy and your freedom to decide what is appropriate in your own system. So this is certainly a challenging balance to find a good way. I think what for me one key learning also from this pandemic was communication-wise, and for example with respect to the vaccine, was that in the beginning it was said, okay, young people, you have to wait. We have to vaccinate the elderlies first, right? And you are less at risk, and so this is why you have to wait. And afterwards, when it was open up and available for everybody, of course, the younger were a bit more reluctant to then get the vaccines. Why? Because we told them for a year, 1.5 years, that they are not so much at risk. And so this communication, which was actually in the moment absolutely probably correct, was then a bit backfiring. And I think these are the challenges, certainly, of this kind of crisis, that at the beginning we do not know how long it lasts, right? So if we would try to take measures for just the next 3 months or half a year, we take different measures and different steps and communicate differently about it, whether when we know, okay, it will last 3 years, and probably this is an important message also we took from this morning, that we have to learn from the past. That at the beginning we could have said, okay, probably this is going to be last 3 years, and probably many people in academia already knew this is going to last, but this was not like how this whole pandemic management was set up and communicated about.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps we can open the floor for question. If anyone in the room has a question, it's still difficult to see the hand with a very strong light, but I think I see one in the middle. Just give the microphone. And perhaps you can mention if your question is also directed to someone specific in the panel, but you can also make open question, and the best one will answer.
To the whole panel. Tom Peter, ETH Zurich. So I'm wondering about a few things. I mean, is it likely that the next pandemic will come very soon, or do you have information on that there is a certain rhythm, certainly no periodicity? So how much time do we have to prepare for the next one? We learned a lot about new vaccines. They will be faster, but what I'm very much missing is other preventive measures. Like, I mean, we spend 90% of our life indoors, and how much do we care actually about the air that we breathe? Is there enough activity in this direction, I'm wondering?
Okay, two difficult questions. Who wants to answer the first about when will be the next pandemic?
Well, you didn't listen to me. So if we look at just look at the record, how often do pandemics happen, and divide them the time with the number of pandemics, you get sort of one every 20 years or something. And if you had asked me 20 years ago, I would have said one every 40 years. So maybe it's happening more often. It's also interesting that the monkeypox outbreak that just happened could actually be seen as a pandemic also. And that just happened 1 year after COVID just started declining. I think what's important here is to separate pandemics, which will happen every 20 years, from the big, horrifying ones where we have to put all stops out and make terrible decisions and do the best we can without enough resource and all of this. And that is probably only once every 100 years. But really our data is very limited for that kind of thing. But that's what we like to say. That's not going to happen super often.
Just to add on the first question, and we go to your next question, there's some discussion, what I hear about, climate change and more interaction between men and animals that might make that there will be more pandemic in the future. Is it just some wrong ideas, or?
That's you?
Go ahead.
Well, I would just say, I mean, if you think about, for example, we're more and more people, we travel a lot more. All these would go towards, these things will get around more often. Climate change is something that's also important because we have vectors for vector-borne diseases traveling to new places, and what knows what happens then. There are a lot of things up in the air, but at the same time, the amount of wild animals out there, that number is going down also thanks to us taking away all the habitats for. So that's kind of, it can go both ways. I think the most scary thing I've heard from a zoonotic expert is really the idea that bats, which are very often implied in new pandemic diseases, they're moving to cities because we took their habitats away. So they're kind of they're moving closer to us. That doesn't sound like a good idea.
Can we go back to your second question? It was about as a measure beyond vaccine, if I got it right.
Yeah, prevention.
Did you want Marcel to answer?
No, I agree with this. I think the air door. I mean, I think as Thomas mentioned, I mean, how do you keep the attention actually on that, right? And so, I always recommend that if people argue about clean indoor air, which is a very important argument that I make myself as well, also try to actually attach it to other things, right? For example, right in the schools, you can also show, well, that actually, having good air is also good for the brain, right? And your brain power actually gets reduced considerably with increasing CO2. Influenza, right? But do not always necessarily attach it to the pandemic because, as you say, right, I mean, we will forget this again and politically it will be very hard to keep these things up and running.
As a question from Christian.
Christian Althaus from the University of Bern. Thanks for the discussion. Some of you mentioned that pandemic preparedness is difficult to sell politically. And I see your point there. But on the other hand, we live in a country that spends a lot of money for military, for example, being surrounded by NATO, which is of no real use, maybe. We also invest a lot in prevention of avalanches, for example, which is kind of a long-term perspective. So we do have these investments that are quite strongly embedded in our culture. And I think what is missing in terms of pandemic preparedness, maybe other aspects in health, is a strong concept of public health. So in English we have a Federal Office of Public Health, but in German it's called Bundesamt für Gesundheit. So the concept of öffentliche Gesundheit is not very strong in Switzerland, in my opinion. So I was wondering whether you have some thoughts how to basically strengthen the topic of public health more strongly on the political landscape.
I don't know who wants to take it.
Well, I can give it a start. I think that when we look at the public discourse, public discussion about like a classic topics such as tobacco and alcohol prevention, we have oftentimes a very a difficult situation. So, and I fully agree that this idea of public health is not so strong in Switzerland. And I think this is reflected when we look at this kind of discourse, because then it's very much argued, for example, that, okay, this should be an individual decision, right? And we should not tell people what to do with their lives. And so it can now be debated with these examples whether it is more because of the big tobacco companies have headquarters in Switzerland and a lot of lobbying, or whether it is really a cultural thing that we do not want to have someone telling us about these health issues, to how we should behave. But I fully agree that this concept of public health is not as strong in Switzerland as in other countries, but maybe also the people from the discipline.
Yeah, no, I mean, Christian, no, I agree. I think, yeah, that's maybe that's one of the things that will change now. I think probably it would be good to get economists on board as well, because I think Swiss are not so special in that regard, right? When you show that this actually is a good investment, then that probably makes it easier. And just continually communicate about it, right? I mean, again, right, the avalanche, because the reason why you fix it is because otherwise the damn things are coming down every winter, right? So you have this very visible thing, and public health, as we all know, the better you do it, the less necessary it seems. That's the true challenge, and so we have to keep on communicating these things. I mean, and this also of the research. I mean, why do we try not to smoke anymore, right? Well, because there are epidemiological studies that show that it's really bad, and And people somehow forget that, right? They think, oh, it's clear, but actually we should continue to communicate this to the public, that this is not per se clear, and it's not, these problems are not just gone like this, but it's continuous scientific investment and then communication of that makes it happen.
Yeah, but I think this is actually a good example where the advocates are missing. So the evidences are there, but the advocates are missing. So if you look at the ranking of how strict the tobacco regulation is in Switzerland, we rank somewhere at the second last place. And I think this is an example of the advocates that are missing. And I asked before whether there are the advocates for the vulnerable groups and the domestic workers, the migrant workers, cleaning personnel and so forth. No, I don't think they do not have advocates. So this will be the challenge, beside having the evidences.
About the surveillance, I don't know if one of you know, is there any program of the Federal of Public Health for future pandemic? Or I don't know if someone in the room know, did they change something in their policy? I think they are not here, if I know, but...
I mean, there's the wastewater surveillance that's now being done. That's already good, and some improvements on the data side. But I think in terms of what the modern public health systems could do, I think there's still much to go.
Do you know from other countries?
Well, I'm jealous of the wastewater surveillance systems we heard about here at this conference.
Yep.
Oh, wow. Think about this is like the future in surveillance, isn't it? You don't have to bother people with nose things, and you just sample the sewage, and you can start with COVID, then you can add flu, RSV, polio, what have you, monkeypox, anything really. And then you can really understand what's going on. For the first time, we could maybe know what hit us when we get pneumonia, and people say, well, it wasn't flu, that's the best you can get. Yeah. It wasn't COVID, what was it? Maybe we can know in the future. So I'm seeing the future here of surveillance, which is something we are opting to scale down now in Denmark, sadly. We just got good at it, and now it's like the money about gone.
Yeah. It's that same long-term problem.
Yeah.
Can I put the question back to you, Nicolas? You're a medical doctor, and also to you, Emanuela, right? You're medical doctors. I think there's also sometimes there has been a bit of a conflict there. The conflict is maybe the wrong words, but obviously, right, medical doctors will continue to play, thankfully, a really important role. And it just seemed that the ones that, how do I say this? The ones that were in charge of certain things, right, were not always necessarily very strongly informed about epidemiology as a science and virology and so on. Is that something that you think, could also change in the context of adjusting the medical curriculum to have a bit stronger, right, scientific and epidemiological foundation, so that the next generation, right, the people who will be in charge in 37 years when that next pandemic starts, I'll be, look at my hair, that there is somebody then, that the people then in charge will actually not have to relearn the basics of public health.
I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer. So in big hospital where I'm working in Bern, we have a lot of contact with infectious disease, with epidemiologists. So I think the information, what I saw was quite good. But you are certainly right, in smaller hospital, perhaps directly by some GPs sometimes, or any people in the community gave sometimes some strange advice to the patient, particularly at the beginning, but also later in the pandemic. And I think to reinforce this topic in medical school, I think would be of benefit of all. I remember from my medical school, it's a bit old, but I remember it was optional. Yeah. So you could take a course about epidemiology of infection, but it was an optional course. I don't know if it did change, but if you have interest in the topic, you can get it and stay 2 hours later in the evening. If you had no interest, it was not mandatory to take it. Perhaps it has changed. I'm sorry for the younger one if it has changed, but it was really not a major topic in the medical school, and I'm not sure if it has changed. I don't know if in Germany, Barbara, you want to mention something?
It's sometimes surprising how many of these issues have been discussed before COVID, and some of them were lessons learned from HIV/AIDS, which was, a very different pandemic that's still around, and also the pandemic flu in 2009-10. And I remember that at different universities, we've started a vaccine training course, for example, for medical students. That's one of the problems that we keep seeing, that the vaccine education is very fractured. Even in pediatricians, even in pediatric infectious disease doctors, they learn very little about vaccinology. And it's kind of, you hear a little bit in the immunology course, a little bit in pediatrics, a little bit. It's kind of scattered throughout medical school and residency training. And after that, there's very little, especially also the communication skills of how to explain preventive measures. There's a lot to be learned from smoking cessation, for example. What is the best moment to intervene? How do I communicate something that I'm trying to prevent that the person maybe thinks they'll never be affected by? You can't show the things that you've prevented. That's one of the problems of these interventions. So we can learn from other fields, but we also have to remember this is not new. These gaps have been there before, and our organization, for example, we have worked with the Coalition for Vaccination, which the European Commission started before the pandemic in 2018-19, which is a big forum of healthcare professionals in all kinds of fields, including nurses, gynecologists, GPs, pediatricians, pharmacists even, to find a common voice on the topic of vaccination and to start thinking around these topics. And we have been tasked to create an educational platform for them where they can find high-level or high-quality educational content, create like a lifetime journey of vaccine education. It's called zeki.eu, and it's now being part of several EU projects. But there has been stuff underway that was kind of hit by the pandemic, but it was already... These were major policy steps in the right direction. There was a whole joint action on vaccination in the EU. There was a roadmap on vaccines, and now we're being asked, so how to continue from here? So I think that continuity from the funding side, from the policy side, is extremely important, because otherwise we keep repeating the same mistakes, which, as we all know, is the definition of insanity, so we don't want that. It's sometimes frustrating. You keep hearing this, and HIV/AIDS was mentioned. I think that was probably the most groundbreaking pandemic in terms of learning how to collaborate across the disciplines and across countries. So we're not starting from zero. We're really starting from a place where, social scientists were involved in HIV/AIDS from the very beginning, patient advocates, journalists, and there was a success derived from that. So let's see the positive sides and learn from them, and hopefully be loud voices for pandemic prevention advocacy.
Thank you. Do you think the NRPA team might answer some of these issues that were mentioned in terms of recommendation?
All of them.
That'd be soft.
Yes, sure, all of them, and for all time.
Everywhere.
Everywhere, exactly. I mean, certainly we will answer many questions, but I think the challenge will certainly be that everything is moving. We do not have like a stable situation, and so many elements are moving. And we heard it this morning in the keynote that previous pandemics and antibodies and so forth can help you in the next one and so forth. And so, of course, our society is not the same as it was before the last pandemic. So we came into this pandemic. We came with the experience of being alerted with respect to the swine flu, and what was managed, and everybody felt safe. And so certainly for a next pandemic, the challenges will be different because we start at a different point. So I think this is why we will answer many questions. But probably for next pandemic, other questions will be relevant, and this is why I think it's good that we have also the discussion here with respect to the academic system and how it works, and just as a system, not only focusing on the specific question, but on the system and how we can prepare the whole academic system for a next pandemic. to then identify the questions that are relevant in this specific situation.
Thanks. Are there other questions from the room?
Or maybe I can just add something.
If you
to
want,
this.
yeah, sure.
I'm been thinking we are going into a new era of pandemiology, which you could call precision pandemiology, because we now have access to data in near real time. We can know next week how many people died in Europe this week. That's pretty remarkable. We actually don't have to wait to evaluate anything. We can get it like this. So data science has a whole new sort of meaning. Or the bioinformatics, same thing. We can know the variants the next day. This is huge. And now we can also control pandemics with vaccines. We never could do that before. They were too slow, or we didn't think about it, or the pandemics were too mild or something. But now we can actually probably really come after them. And this is exciting. This is gives some hope, doesn't it? We have something to come with.
Yeah, the flip side, and I hate to be, because I'm usually the optimist, but the flip side
you made your
is is that, and something that I find worrying and not too much talked about, but I mean the whole sort of engineering aspects, right? Engineering high pathogen variants, right? It's not currently on the roadmap really for many people, but you look at where things are heading, right? This will clearly be an option. I mean, these things are not so complex. I mean, you know, no offense to any virologists, but right, in terms of a biological entity, as far as biological entities goes, they are relatively straightforward, and clearly we're going into a future, and we can maybe discuss when that can be done almost at home, right, to a certain extent. I mean, the DIY biology is the same now where DIY computers were 50 years ago. Yes, they used to be in a big hall with government funding, and then eventually now they're in our pockets, right, and everybody can have one and make one. And so that will put us in a whole different regime that I think we're not capable at the moment even to discuss, because it would just break conceptually pretty much everything. But that's just to say that I agree with you, right? The future is just going to be so completely different in good ways and in bad ways, and where that balance will be will
Both
just
ways.
be interesting to see.
Yeah, I fully agree with this idea of that we have a real-time monitoring, and decision makers sit in front of a dashboard, and everything is moving in real time. I think this is certainly the case. But the challenge for social science and humanities then will be to get on this dashboard. And so we have to develop instruments that are faster, and they also provide this insight. So we also need this moving needle there in the dashboard that gives us information on the well-being of different axes of the vulnerable people, of their fears and the sorrows and so forth. And so this I think is the challenge, and was the, or in other words, also the danger of exactly what you mentioned, right? So that we have our sensors in the wastewater and everywhere, and then rely on this information that are seemingly objective and precise and real-time measures.
Yes, I think it is important to mention that a lot of homework has to be done to really take the advantages out of data science. And I just want to mention at the beginning of the crisis, it was realized how health data transfer still is running in Switzerland, and that's really ridiculous. And we have a lot of homework which has to be done, especially in the healthcare system. We need better IT infrastructures, and this has to be pushed forward. And even more, we need standards for data, semantics, labels, data transfer. That's very important to prepare this for now, actually, and to advance this field before the next pandemic is coming.
May I ask a critical question about your point? I think, as you mentioned, it's correct. So great technology, a lot of data. We can know worldwide where also the people dying. Also, transfer of data is easier. Despite all these technology advancements that are certainly very useful, we failed to prevent a global pandemic. So, what didn't go correctly? We have all this data, but the pandemic was global with a lot of people dying still.
But that was what I was trying to say. If we're out in the business to prevent the next pandemic, we will surely fail, because that's just, there's so many threats. You can't know where to look. You can't. It's just really hard to do. But you can at least stop doing the things we know are not very smart, like having mammals in wet markets that are all these things. This is not rocket science. This was a bad idea 2 times. So some things we can do, but I don't think we can sort of prevent. That would be like setting yourself up for failure every time.
Yes. Okay. Any other question from the room? If not, I don't know if someone has to. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Just a comment, not really a question. Emily Rosenstein from the University of Applied Science, Western Switzerland. I have to say that since yesterday, I have a major pleasure to listen to all of you, to finally discover in real this community of people worried about the teachings of the pandemic. But I also have to say, and I hope I won't be too negative at the end of this day, that I'm not sure that outside of this building, people are waiting that much for our results. I rather have the impression that people are now in other crises. The other crises are not pandemic, but they are also already running. There is the war, there is the economy that goes bad, etc., etc. And so I think that we are in a very different position now with this NRP 80 starting, etc., because it will be part of the job to be struggling and pushing this result and insisting on why we need to take the lessons of the pandemic. But anyway, we have another day to carry on discussing about that.
I don't know if someone wants to comment on that, the different crises. I don't know. Tom.
Well, I fully agree, and I also gave the example before that it will be a fight for attention. But I don't think we can change the context our NRP is in. So let's take the good out of it, that we are not so on a heavy time pressure, right? So, but of course, we need to find our strategies to get heard. And I think this is then the advantage of now having an NRP, and it's not 25 projects, because together we have a critical mass to get heard, right? And so when we can answer a question and a challenge from different perspectives and go with these solutions to the stakeholders, I'm convinced that we will be heard. So let's take it as an advantage that we have in our NRP and that we have time. We're not under time pressure.
Well, it's very true. I mean, the world is on to the next thing already. You definitely feel that. I think in my country, we've gotten to a strange phase of the last that's left of interesting for Corona is the reckoning of all the things we did wrong and how we should have done, like Sweden or whatever. All these things, they come up now and occupy the media. That's kind of how that's really actually not very pleasant.
Yeah.
Because I really don't think it was true, of course. That's my whole point, is that actually went quite well. So why take it apart after?
We are always better at the end of the crisis to say what was done wrong. Yeah. Okay, I don't know if any remaining question or an important point from the panel that we forgot to mention for future pandemic.
Well, I have one. I'm burning in with one thing, which is for all of you. I have learned that actually every canton could make their own decisions about what to do in the pandemic. Yet I've also learned that not every canton has hospitals, for example. How do you handle the situation that one canton may decide to do nothing, but their patients would have to be hospitalized in the next one? I'm sorry, but maybe it's too provocative. But how is this even possible?
This is regulated by contracts all over the country. So there are centers as Bern, as Zurich, with a triage to certain cantons. Okay. And the money is transferred to the central cantons. This is quite well organized.
I see.
During the pandemic, sometimes probably you had the same problem. The severe patients were transferred to the centers, and it was not possible to transfer them back. So there was an overload of the centers in general.
Thank you.
But we had a network, so the Society of Intensive Care Medicine, we were very well connected to have a database to know where the beds, where there are free beds still. And there was quite a close connectivity between the ICUs all over the country. This was quite well running. I think, Nicolas, you had the same impression. And it was very fast set up.
I think your point was also discussed in the lay press. Is it really good that each canton could do something different? Yeah. I think, I don't know, perhaps might be also a topic in your NRP 80. Is it really good? It's true. One canton could decide something very different. Somewhat different than another one. Is it a good system, or should it be different in the case of a pandemic? So in the first phase, if I'm right, then there was a special law so that the rules were the same across the country, about the same, but then it changed over the pandemic, if I'm right. Marcel, you can correct me.
We've built a sophisticated system over the past 150 years of keeping 26 little kingdoms running together forward. Yeah.
Even half canton.
We're not supposed to say that anymore. No.
Okay, so we are on time. So thanks very much for the public to stay so late. Hopefully also some people online learn something, and thanks very much to all of you for the very nice discussion, and hopefully some important inputs for the future. And thanks again to have taken part to this meeting and to all the discussion, and to travel also from Denmark to come to Switzerland.
Good.
Thanks again. Have a nice evening.